Hi there, and welcome to this screencast substitute for our Week 4 seminar. Here's what we're going to look at today. First of all, the usual check-ins and reminders. Second, we're going to offer a brief orientation to Microsoft Teams in terms of how we will use it for submitting your rough draft of the Discourse Community Analysis assignment and also for doing peer review. Third thing we're going to do is to talk briefly about the important issue of transferable skills. And last but not least, focusing back on the Discourse Community Analysis, we're going to talk about the matter of credibility and research. So let's get started. In terms of check-ins and reminders, your first draft of the Discourse Community Analysis will be due Friday, June 10th, and it will be due at the same time as our seminar is normally held on Fridays. The next step in the Discourse Community Analysis is that you will have until Sunday, June 12th at the end of the day to complete and submit 2 peer reviews of rough drafts of other people in your class. And part of what we're going to be talking about here today is the process we'll be following for that. And by the way, there is also a separate YouTube video that I've created that goes into more detail about instructions for doing that. So let's talk briefly about how we're going to be using Microsoft Teams for the DCA first draft peer review. So what you will need to do first off is to submit a complete rough draft to Microsoft Teams in time for our Friday seminar. So that's the first step, is to submit your rough draft to Microsoft Teams, and then the second step is to complete and to upload peer reviews for 2 people in the private channel on Microsoft Teams that we'll be creating for you in order to do your peer review. So just drilling down a little bit more in terms of Microsoft Teams, there are 2 ways to access Microsoft Teams. The first way to access Microsoft Teams is by way of the invite that you received in your Outlook email. The second way to access Microsoft Teams is through Microsoft Outlook. For instance, if you are on your email and you look at the keypad icon in the top left corner and click on it, Microsoft Teams will be one of the applications that you'll see in that menu that pops up, and you can access it that way as well. What I will say right here is that we have what Microsoft Teams calls a team for our entire class, and within that team I am creating private channels. So a private channel just simply means a place, a workspace for a small group of 3 to 4 people. It's within those small groups that you will be conducting peer review. The other piece in the mix here is that I will be uploading to Microsoft Teams the fillable form that we'll be using for peer review. How you'll get graded for this: you'll receive 2% if you have submitted your rough draft on time in Microsoft Teams, and you have also completed and submitted 2 peer reviews by the deadline. So let's now talk about transferable skills. Transferable skills refer to the skills that you pick up in the course of your education, which are transferable to a variety of different applications and to specific jobs. This becomes very important when you are applying for positions, and both in your resume and your cover letter, if you have a knowledge of transferable skills and how to talk about them, that's when you can flag experiences that you have accumulated, perhaps in other types of jobs, that would be of interest to a potential employer as a transferable skill. The knowledge of transferable skills helps you to have a better idea of what to emphasize, what to downplay, and what to omit on a resume, or for that matter, on a cover letter. Ultimately, knowing how to work with transferable skills makes you a much better professional communicator when you are applying for positions. Allows you to be much more intentional with how you're messaging and connecting with the expectations of your audience. What we're going to do now is to have a quick look at the transferable skills handout that you get access to in this week's self-directed learning once you complete the knowledge check. Okay, so here's the transferable skills document. This is courtesy of Career Services at Fleming College. First thing I want to focus on here is the little preamble at the top of the page. The following is an inventory of skills that are transferable from one job to another. So the other thing I want to point out here is how we list transferable skills. You'll notice that all of the transferable skills here in this checklist are listed in a way that begins with a verb. Resolved conflict, analyzed situations or data, handled complaints, used social media. The fact that those are all listed beginning with an action verb is a clue to how those can best be used in your resume when you are listing things that you have done in terms of transferable skills. So what we're going to talk about now is the issue of research and credibility. First of all, where we've been. In other words, what are the kinds of things that we were introduced to in Communications 1? We were introduced to the concept of credibility, what credibility is, and why it's extremely important in our written communication. The other thing that we introduced in Communications 1 was this distinction between primary and secondary sources. Thirdly, we introduced you to APA citation and documentation in Communications 1. Where we're going in Communications 2, in this course, we are going to review the issue of credibility, and we'll start that today. We're also going to be doing some review on the nuts and bolts of conducting research and using research in our writing. Third thing that we're going to review is the issue of what kinds of information sources you need to cite and document. So new to this course, we're going to be introducing you to how to use library resources here at Fleming College. We're also going to be talking about the difficult issue of how we evaluate sources that we find online. We're going to be doing that by introducing you to a very simple critical thinking tool called the CRAP test. By the way, that's not crap, that's C-R-A-A-P. So we're going to be going into what that acronym means and how it can be useful to you. We're also going to be doing review on how to cite and document sources of information that you use in your writing. So let's talk a little bit more about credibility. What you're seeing here is a tweet from Donald J. Trump, former President of the United States, and this is a tweet that he wrote the day after the 2020 U.S. election. It says, "Last night I was leading, often solidly in many key states, in almost all instances Democrat-run and controlled. Then one by one, they started to magically disappear as surprise ballot dumps were counted. Very strange, and the pollsters got it completely and historically wrong." So there's only one problem with his tweet, and it's a huge problem, and that is that the tweet is factually incorrect, and that's putting it politely. The issue is not that Trump wasn't leading. He was leading early on in the election, and he was leading until the point when mail-in ballots were counted. Why is that? Because Trump had scared his own followers away from using mail-in ballots, the mail-in ballot portion of the vote count was overwhelmingly Democrat. What you can see here in what I've circled on this slide is what Twitter began to do in response to some of his tweets. You can see that I've circled a sidebar at the top of his tweet. It says some or all of the content shared in this tweet is disputed and might be misleading about an election or other civic process. Now, what you almost certainly know is that at some point after this response by Twitter, they basically banned him from Twitter, and he still to this day remains banned from Twitter. So credibility is important. To be credible is to be trustworthy or believable. And there's a strong connection here between credibility and documentation. Documentation is to, quote, supply a reference telling readers that you borrowed material and where you borrowed it from, end quote. Now, that is not only an explanation of documentation, it's also a really good example of documentation. You can see I've used a quotation there, and at the end of the quotation, I am citing the source of the quotation, Aaron and Morrison, 2013, page 331. So that is stuff that we will be going over. The next question, of course, is what kind of source material will help establish your credibility as a writer? Where do you locate it? How do you locate it? What kind of material needs to be documented? So before you took Communications 1, maybe where you got your source material looked a little bit like this. Mostly personal experience, maybe to a lesser extent friends' experience, and then you could see the smallest portion of all is source material from facts and evidence. Hopefully now, with that first communication course behind us, where we get our source material, looks a little bit more like this, and where we're looking at sort of equal parts personal experience, credible sources, facts, and evidence. Where we're heading in this course, with our emphasis on professional communications, is something that looks like this, where you're placing much more emphasis on credible sources and authorities and facts and evidence. It isn't to say that your personal experience isn't important, but that we are placing the onus on facts and evidence from secondary sources. So now that I've mentioned secondary sources, let's go through the different types of sources that we can imagine using as research. First of all, we have primary sources. And primary simply refers to any information that you, the writer, gather yourself. It could be from interviewing someone. It could be from something that you witnessed yourself. It could be from a survey or poll that you design and collect the data from. It could be from any other kind of data collection, all completed by you. Then we have secondary sources, and really this is the preponderance of the sources that you are using not only in this course but your other courses, and that refers to published or posted material. Websites, books, articles in newspapers, magazines, and journals. Okay, that's all secondary sources of information. We can also talk about tertiary sources of information, and this really is in reference to reference sources such as your course textbooks, such as Wikipedia. So bringing this all back to your discourse community analysis, you are going to be receiving the benefit of peer review from 2 of your classmates. And you might be asking yourself, well, what am I supposed to do at that point in terms of revising my DCA? First of all, you want to look at the peer reviews that you got from a couple of classmates. Then you want to reread the assignment for yourself with fresh eyes. And then what we are advising you to do is to go back to the instructions, especially the portion of the instructions that says, what am I supposed to write under each section heading? Next on your horizon is to complete your 2 peer reviews. Thanks very much.